So now we're going to talk about the activation of T cells. So the activation takes place when the APC, so the antigen presenting cells, bind with the CD4 positive cells, right? APCs are what again? They were the cells that bring the custodian cells, right? So the macrophages, the, what else? Dendritic cells, the B cells. And then your CD4 positive cells, or another name for them are the helper T cells, are present. And when they combine, they're able to generate an adaptive immune response. One of the activation is activation of the helper of the T cells, right? So the helper T cells, cytotoxic T cells, etc. Okay? So here, there's a little receptor here on the antigen presenting cell that's presenting the actual antigen. Remember what this is called. This is called the major histocompatibility complex, MHC. So this has MHC1 or 2 as MHC2 receptor, because antigen presenting cells present this to the helper T cells on the MHC2 receptor. And they bring this here next to the CD4 cell where it binds to the TCR receptor here. Binds specifically to the TCR receptor, so T cell receptor, and also its CD4 receptor. So remember, CD4 receptor basically stands for cell differentiation marker, right? And it's like a glycoprotein on top of each cell that gives them the cells their identity, right? And in order to have an activation, right, you need to have both of these receptors bind to the MHC complex, right? And so the activation requires two specific processes. The first process here, I will put it right below here. Number one, it is antigen actually binding. So the antigen must combine to these receptors and generate a response. And the second is a co-stimulation that takes place. A co-stimulation where certain molecular receptors become active and they send signals for the cell to generate a response, right? So if we look at the first response here, the cell, the helper T cell must come in here and have a double recognition. So double recognition means that this TCR and the CD4 receptor, specifically this TCR receptor, T cell receptor here, must come in first, identify the antigen as one recognition site, and then also recognize the MHC2 complex, right? Both of those must be organized and arranged and active in order to trigger the first response. And this is where you have the antigen binding response that becomes important, all right? After this is taking over now, you have them now meshed together. You need to have a second response in order to have complete activation of these T cells, right? So specifically here is the helper T cell. Other T cells, for example, the cytotoxic T cells use different receptors, for example, right? So we use MHC1 for the cytotoxic T cells because they're different type of cells, right? And so the stimulatory response here is these receptors next. Let's see what's a different color I can use maybe. It's the B7 and the CD28 receptor. Okay, so the CD28 receptor is usually on the cell that's presenting the antigen, and then the B7 here is present on the T cell, right? And both of these need to bound together in order to stimulate each other. You need this co-stimulation to further generate a response, right? And so this becomes important when we're looking at tumor recognition, right? So tumor recognition, so certain type of cells that become tumor infected, right? They are unable to generate an immune response. So what they do is they present their antigen on the cell surface, on their MHC1, because we're looking at specifically all cells, right? And so this receptor plays a big role as co-stimulation in order to further allow that specific T cell, so the cytotoxic T cell, which goes specifically for the MHC1 in order to lyse and destroy the cell, right? So both of these need to be taking place in order to generate the activation of the helper T cells and the cytotoxic T cells. Whether to generate a response of destruction, it all really depends on the cell type that is being activated, right? So helper T cells don't really destroy, right? The cytotoxic T cells do. And so in this case now, when you have the antigen binding to the TCR and the CD4, right, and you have that double recognition taking place, and after you have this co-stimulation, in this scenario, you have your helper T cells actually go in and generating an adaptive response, where whether it's activating your B cells to generate antibodies or your cytotoxic T cells or natural killer T cells to generate a direct immune reaction.